Hi Bible 101, it's Sarah. It's good to see you again. It's been a long time, feels like, since our last class. But we're back. Happy Eastertide. We are going to talk about the kings of Israel today. We have a lot to cover, but I want to look back just for a moment and remember what it is we've focused on so far in the Hebrew Bible. We have looked at the stories of creation. We have looked at some of the important people in the early years of developing our covenant with God. People like Noah and Abraham and Moses. We also looked at some of the writings of the prophets, particularly around Advent and reading what they wrote and thought about the Messiah coming. And we also took a look at the Psalms. So, we've done a lot. Now it's time to move on to another little bit of history that you can find in the Hebrew Bible, and that is the history of the development of the monarchy, the kings of Israel. And there are three that we're going to talk about today: King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. But they didn't start as kings. You're going to hear interesting things about how they did start and how they became kings. But before we can meet the kings of Israel, we need to meet Samuel. Samuel was a prophet, and he anointed Saul the first king of Israel. And before we can even meet Samuel, we need to meet his mom. Her name was Hannah. Okay, so we're going to start by finding in our Bibles the first book of Samuel. There are two books of Samuel: 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. You'll also see that there is the first book of Kings and the second book of Kings. So that's where we are spending our time this week. So to find 1 Samuel, one hint is that it comes before the Psalms. So you might remember the Psalms are kind of near the middle of your Bible. So you have to go a little earlier to find the first book of Samuel. So right away in 1 Samuel, we meet Hannah. And she is one of two wives of a man. That used to be a thing back then. Men would have more than one wife. And the other wife had a lot of kids. Lots, like maybe 10, I think. But Hannah hadn't had a baby. And Hannah was sad. She really wanted to have a child. So every year, Hannah and her husband and her husband's other wife and all the kids, the whole family, would travel to Shiloh, where there was a temple. And at this temple, there was a prophet, a religious man named Eli. And he sort of took care of the temple, and he was someone that you could go to speak to about your relationship with God. So one year, Hannah went to the temple and she prayed. She prayed really fervently for a child. And her lips were moving and she looked really concerned, and Eli was not sure what was going on. He was watching her. And he went up to her and he was like, are you drunk? And she said, no, I'm praying to God. I would like a son. I'm praying that I will give birth to a son. And if I do, if God finds favor with me, I will offer him back to God by offering him to learn here at the temple from people like you. So Eli listened and looked at her again with new eyes, and he was impressed. So he said to her, go in peace. The God of Israel grant the petition you have made to him. So she went home, and lo and behold, Hannah had a son. And she named him Samuel. And when he was old enough, but still a child, she takes him to the temple in Shiloh, and she introduces him to Eli and says, remember me? Remember I was looking to God for a baby? Well, I have my baby. Here he is. He's grown up a little, and I would like him to learn from you here at the temple. And so Eli agreed that he would teach him the way of the prophets. And then Hannah prayed a beautiful prayer that you can find in 1 Samuel. It's in the second chapter. It's the beginning of the second chapter of 1 Samuel. And her prayer is very much like the prayer that Mary prays when she is pregnant with Jesus. That prayer is called the Magnificat. Sometimes we sing it. And both of the prayers speak of God lifting up the poor. One thing Hannah says is, He, God, He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. She has a really beautiful vision for what God can do for the poor, much like Mary did when she was pregnant with Jesus. So Samuel is now at the temple, living there with Eli, and Hannah comes and visits him, when she comes to pray and offer things to God. So he's living at the temple, and one night when he's sleeping, he hears a voice calling his name, Samuel, Samuel. So he jumps up and he runs to Eli, who's getting a little older and can't see very well. And he says, I'm here. You called me. And Eli says, I didn't call you. Go back to bed. So Samuel goes back to bed. And it happens again. Samuel, Samuel. So he jumps up and again he runs to Eli. He says, I'm here. You're calling me. He said, nope, not calling you. So then it happens a third time. And yes, this time finally Eli gets it. Oh, maybe God is speaking to Samuel. So Eli tells Samuel the next time it happens, this is what you should say. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. You can find that in chapter 3, verse 9 of 1 Samuel. So Samuel does this. When God calls him the next time, he says, speak, for your servant is listening. And this begins Samuel's very special relationship with God as a very wise prophet of Israel. So, okay, what about those kings, right? Now we've met Hannah and her son Samuel, who is now a grown man and is a prophet. So a few chapters later, we meet a young man named Saul. In fact, he's described as a handsome young man of Israel. And we hear how Saul's father is very wealthy and has a lot of donkeys, except the problem is the donkeys are missing. They have gone astray and no one can find them. So Saul's father says, take this boy with you and go find the donkeys. So Saul goes, can't find them anywhere. So they start wandering around looking for the donkeys. And the boy that came with Saul says, we should go to that prophet, that seer named Samuel, and see if he'll help us. Because Samuel is by now a grown man who, is known throughout the land. But little did the boy or Saul know that the day before God had spoken to Samuel and said, tomorrow about this time, I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him to be ruler over my people, Israel. And he shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines, for I have seen the suffering of my people, because their outcry has come to me. That's from chapter 9, verses 15 and 16. So Samuel is now been told by God to expect someone to come to him who will become the ruler of Israel. So here comes Saul, the young man with the boy, and he goes to Samuel and he says, are you Samuel? Are you the great prophet? I need your help. I'm looking for my donkeys. And Samuel tells him, no, not only that his donkeys are safe and they've been found, but that Saul has been chosen by God to lead all of Israel. And Saul is like, what? I just wanted to find my donkeys. But he says, I'm just a young man. My family is kind of humble. We're from the smallest tribe of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin. Remember, Benjamin was one of the brothers of Joseph, and there were 12 of them, and they were the 12 tribes of Israel. He says, we're like the lowliest. Why do you think I should be this ruler? Samuel insists that Saul will be anointed as the king of Israel. And so then it says, Samuel took a vial of oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him. And he said, the Lord has anointed you ruler over God's people Israel. You shall reign over the people of the Lord, and you will save them from the hand of their enemies all around. And thus we have the first king of Israel, King Saul. I'm going to stop there and let Phil take over to talk more about Saul and David and Solomon. Have fun.